All right. Well, I thought we'd do a little follow-up from last session based on some questions I got in the break. First question was, well, you used to do a band to be in the community. What are you doing now to be in the community? So what I do now is I play pickleball. And I play a lot of pickleball. And boy, you talk about a ministry platform. Pickleball is great for that. And it's a lot of fun. So that's what I do now. Another question I had was, what happens to the people in this village when they become Christians? Is there persecution? And it's a great question. And I would answer it that often there is a lot of persecution. Often that persecution comes from the outside. But one of the strategies that the missionaries employ is trying to lead groups of people to Christ instead of just one person at a time. Because if you lead one person to Christ, they don't have any community around them. And if you notice the story in Egypt and with the husband and wife, both of them became believers, not in a group, but on their own. And it's very easy for them to be ostracized as a result of that. But this strategy that was used in Senegal is designed for a group of people to come to Christ together. Now, there's actually some downsides to group conversions, and the downside is sometimes people convert just to be part of the group without really having understanding of what's happening. So there's a downside to that, but for the most part, missionaries are working to try to bring groups of people to Christ together. I'm going to read you, before we get into the next section, I'm going to read you another story about this. I call this a composite sketch because it's actually two stories I put together by the request of the people involved because they didn't want to be identified. But it's about a guy named Ahmed. So in 2009, Ahmed was working in his job as a customs official. This is in an Asian country. His role involved registering cars and other large imports. And one day, a gentleman whose name was Mehmet came to his office to get his car registered. So Ahmed was handling the paperwork, and he saw Mehmet's identity card said Christian on the identity card. And in this mostly Muslim country in which they lived, this was rather unusual. And as Mehmet sat in his office fiddling with his phone and waiting, Ahmed was thinking about this Christian named Mehmet. For the past few weeks, Ahmed himself had some dreams. In the dream, he saw a man he felt was the prophet Isa, Jesus. The prophet was calling to him, asking him to come and come quickly. The details in each of the dreams were different, but that figure calling him was in every one of them. Now, here in his own office was a man with a Christian identity card, and he wanted so much to ask him about Isa, who he knew was connected with Christianity, but he didn't know how to bring the topic up. So as he was thinking about this, he just blurted it out. He just said, "Were you born a Christian?" And he held up Mehmet's identity card, and Mehmet looked up from his phone, startled at the abrupt question. He paused for a brief moment and said, "No, my identity card was changed a few years ago to Christian." And Ahmed took that in because he was not expecting that answer, and he wasn't quite sure how to follow up. The obvious question was why, but that seemed too straightforward. So he decided it was best to say nothing, and so he just nodded slowly and went back to his task. After some minutes of silence, Mehmet spoke up. "Have you ever met a Christian from among our people?" he asked. And Ahmed said in reply, "No, I never have. I didn't know there were any." I didn't ask to have my identity card changed," responded Mehmet. "It was the government that made me do it." And Ahmed stopped working and looked up. Why would they request that? A number of us were gathering to read the Injil, the New Testament. When the local imam found out, he was very angry. He told us to stop, but we didn't. And a few weeks later, I was taken to the police station. "What had you done wrong?" asked Ahmed. "Well, nothing according to the law, but the imam was very serious about making us stop reading the Injil. And I was not willing to stop, and so they put me in jail." I don't get this. What had you done wrong? Asked Ahmed once again. Do you know of Isa al-Masih? Asked Mehmed. Ahmed struggled to hide his shock. The images in his dreams flooded his mind. He stared hard at Mehmed. Yes, I know of Isa al-Masih, the messenger and prophet, but I don't know much about him. Do you study him? Yes, I study him. He is a special prophet. Well, how do you study him? His story, replied Mehmed, has been written in the Injil, my friend. You can study about him too if you wish. If you would be willing to gather some friends in your home, I will give you portions of the Injil and you can study for yourself. I'll think about this, said Ahmed in reply. The room fell silent as he pulled out a large official stamp from his desk. He pounded a circular mark on the papers, handed them to Mehmed, and asked, when will you bring me this Injil? Talk to your friends this week. I will stop by this office next week, and we'll discuss this further. You can tell your friends that you met a follower of Isa al-Masih. So during the week, Ahmed cautiously reached out to his neighbors. His brother, also, who lived a few doors from him, was more than eager to study the Injil. He was young, and he liked new ideas. His lifelong friend and closest confidant, Muhammad, was also willing. He was very religious and had spent a number of years memorizing the Quran, although he had forgotten most of it by now. They each spoke to a few others, and the dreams continued. When Mehmed returned to the customs office the next week, Ahmed was disappointed that he carried no book with him. Greetings, friend, said Mehmed. Do you have some others that would like to study with you? Yes, I do, but you didn't bring the Injil with you, replied Ahmed. Well, we study the Injil in many ways. There is not an Injil that has been translated completely into our language. We only have parts, or we can use the trade language. I see, said Ahmed. So how do you study it? Mehmed flashed a grin. It's here, he said, holding up his phone. What we have is on the phone. I will text you a link, and you can find the holy text on the phone. I see, said Ahmed. That makes sense. I hear the Injil is corrupted. How do we know the words are true? I don't believe the words are corrupted, Ahmed, but I want you to discover that for yourself. It is better simply to read the words and learn from them. I'm going to send you 2 links. The first one is directly to the text of the Injil. They are stories of Isa al-Masih. They're powerful. To understand them, you can study the stories in the second link. Oh, we could do that. Do we just read the stories? No, there is more if we really want to understand. He took a small piece of paper out of his pocket. Here's a list of things you can do when you meet together. Ahmed nodded in agreement. That sounds like a good way to start. Are you going to come and join us? No, I don't think I can at first. I think you should meet without me and just discuss your stories. I can come later if you like. Some of your friends might not be able to openly talk with you if I am there. It's better this way. Okay, said Ahmed, and he looked at the paper. It looked very easy to follow. So 2 days later, a group of men gathered in Ahmed's home. They sat in a circle while drinking thick cups of spiced coffee. Finally, Ahmed got everybody's attention. I'm going to read the first story out loud. Before I do, let's all mention something which Allah has done for us, for which we are thankful. One by one, they mentioned family, jobs, and unexpected blessings. These are all good things, said Ahmed, and we recognize Allah's hand in them. I will now read the story. When I am done, I will ask one of you to repeat it, so listen up. A few of them chuckled. Ahmed read the story, and the men leaned in, listening intently. When it was over, one of them said, I will repeat the story, and he did so. The story was about the creation of the world. Ahmed looked at his outline and then asked, what does this story teach us about God? They talked for about 10 minutes, making observations and providing details from the story. How about the story's message for us as people? What does it say about mankind? Again, they talked for a while. One of the men made a point very adamantly, and the room fell silent as he pushed his point just a bit too far. Okay, then let's move on, interrupted Ahmed. Is there anything else in this story that God is telling us to do? The same man who spoke fervently earlier said, yes, we are to acknowledge and honor God for his greatness. He created all things, and we are also his creation. We should be grateful. The room broke out in supporting murmurs. "Now, what should we do about this truth?" asked Ahmed. One by one, they all pitched in with their view of submission to God's greatness. They agreed, and in the end, they said that they would all tell friends and neighbors who were not present about this story. Ahmed asked the men to stand, and he led them in a short prayer of closing and blessing. So that's a very typical discovery Bible study that's done among Muslims. And they would then get together in the next week, and they would go through the next story. And over time, they would be building an understanding of who Jesus is by starting in the Old Testament and working their way all the way forward to the New Testament. Do you see any other strategies embedded in how Ahmed went about this? There's 3 or 4 other really interesting strategies. Right. Yep. He said, think about the people in your circle and invite them. That's great. That's a good one. What's another one? Come on. Yeah, they're trying to pull out. It's directed, but it's not. It's really asking them to think about it, for them to understand it for themselves, to read the text, and again, inductively kind of figure out what's happening there. Good. If you notice, he wasn't present for the meeting. He encouraged them to meet on their own first. Now, that can be a little controversial among missionaries, because without a missionary there to guide the conversation, somebody could say something heretical. They could get the teaching wrong. Okay, so not everybody agrees that this method is the best way to go. But they're doing some pretty basic Bible study here, okay? So I don't think the danger's too great. There's one other thing I would point out or mention I'd want you to see in this story. Anybody see one other thing? It's related to that persecution question. It's a group of friends together, okay? If they make a decision together as a group and persecution comes, they have each other, all right? Instead of it just being one of them all alone, the goal here is to get them together to process this information and see them become believers together. So those are all kind of embedded in that story. Now, in the case of the Senegal church, they didn't just have 40 cassette tapes about Jesus. They also have about 40 cassette tapes about what it means to be a disciple, what it means to be a church, what it means to become mature in Christ in many different ways. And so the stories didn't stop with just the evangelism. The missionaries then gave them further instruction from the epistles and tried to mature and grow and develop them. And in some cases, they have to provide even more training, particularly for the leaders that would be in that village. So in that particular movement, there were times when villages became Christian, and then the regional imam would come in and harass them, or they would very often say, okay, we're going to build a mosque in this village. And they would actually build a mosque right in that little village. And they would fight back and try to keep Christianity from coming in to the region. So, but the gospel there continues to grow. It continues, and I wouldn't call it necessarily, I wouldn't say grow like wildfire, but in that particular case, I feel like it's growing slowly, but with a really good, firm foundation to this day. So, now we got to move forward. We're going to run out of time because the next one's the big kahuna. It's the Matthew 28, 18 through 20 verses that are so important. So we did talk up here about John 20, 21 being the model, Mark 16, 15 being the magnitude. Now Matthew 28 really 18 through 20. I put 19, but I'm going to pick up 18 is the method. The method. All right? The chart that's too small to read. We're not going to have time to review that, but let's talk about the method. The task given by Jesus to the church through the disciples that authorizes it to carry the gospel everywhere so that all peoples might have the opportunity to believe on Christ as their Savior and lifelong follower and become lifelong followers of Him is the Great Commission. These brief accounts of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances to the disciples cannot include everything Jesus said when He was with them. He likely spent hours speaking to them, mentioning additional things not including in the gospel records. One thing He must have told the disciples during the encounter mentioned in Mark was that they were to meet Him again because, again, they met up. They met up on a specific mountain in Galilee, just as was pre-announced by the angels at the tomb. If you go back to Matthew 28:7, this meeting is mentioned. It would be at least a 3-day walk from Jerusalem to get to Galilee where they were going. So having 2 encounters with their resurrected Lord behind them, they left Jerusalem and they made their way north to Galilee. Now they were very happy to get there. This was their home territory. Not everybody realizes this, but every disciple originated from Galilee. All right? They were all from this area, and now they're essentially going back home. In fact, that area is where Jesus actually spent most of His ministry on earth, ministering and working. I had the great pleasure back in October, November, to spend some time up in this area. You can actually visit a synagogue that they've unearthed there, and it has 3 layers. The top layer is actually a Roman pagan temple that was built on top of it. Then there's kind of a medieval synagogue, and underneath that is a synagogue that goes all the way back to the 1st century, and most likely the one that Jesus Himself would walk in and out of when He was visiting in Capernaum. You can only see the top of the door. The rest of it's below ground. They haven't excavated the bottom of it yet. There actually was one disciple that wasn't from Galilee. You know who that was? Judas. He's the only one. Galilee is the place where they would feel the most safe, away from the hostile environment that still loomed back in Jerusalem because of their connection with the condemned Jesus. The mountain air and the lapping sea of Galilee would therapeutically soothe whatever lingering trauma they were experiencing. You know, a few years ago, my wife Annette and I were asked to join a group of missionaries in China, and they were looking for a place to meet where they wouldn't be watched and scrutinized. And so we went way out in western China, and what's the big city there? It's Urumqi. Okay, flew to Urumqi. Then we got in some vehicles and we drove way up in the mountains. They're called the Heavenly Mountains. And way up in this secluded place, the missionaries finally felt like they could kind of let their hair down and be who they were and say what they wanted about their work and their ministry. That's kind of the picture here, right? Jesus has taken them back to a safe place. The 11 likely took some time to meet with their families before proceeding to the mountain Jesus had designated for their meeting. You know, we often see in the Gospels that whenever Jesus wanted to impart something important to the disciples, what would He do? He'd take them away to a quiet or secluded place. That's what He does here. Many times His place of preference was on a mountain. There was good reason why Jesus especially wanted this isolated retreat setting for this next installment of the commission, because this was going to be the most detailed missional instruction of the 5. World evangelization hinged upon them fully comprehending the details He was about to pass to them. At the same time, He was going to be passing to them the methodology He wanted them to employ as they carried the gospel to the ends of the earth. He wanted to make sure they got it right. At this meeting, Jesus was very intentional and most exacting. Why do you think it was the Apostle Matthew that recorded this? Well, if we recall Matthew's previous profession, the answer is not too difficult to discover. Matthew was a tax collector before becoming a follower of Jesus. As such, he was skilled in record keeping. His livelihood depended upon accurate bookkeeping. And Jesus wanted these details captured for us. It is not hard to imagine that possibly Matthew, with parchment and stylus in hand, was taking notes on what Jesus was saying in this very meeting. Open any English version of the Bible, and you'll discover the heading Great Commission inserted somewhere before Matthew 28. Some Bibles have it before verse 1, others have it ahead of verses 16 or 18. All have the phrase somewhere, even though it is clear the heading was never part of the original text. Many centuries after Matthew penned his gospel, Bible translators inserted it into the body of the text to guide readers into understanding the far-reaching implications of this passage. Commenting on this phrase, Patrick Johnson claims that a theology of mission by the proponents of the Great Commission has often been too simplistic and lacking in comprehensiveness. He then adds that the Great Commission has been overexploited by those committed to its implementation and ignored by the rest of the church. Whatever the case may be, this heading has been part of English Bibles for over 500 years. In this instance, the adjective great is an appropriate modifier of commission. Because of all the commissions we find in the Scriptures, none compares to the greatness of this one, because it is far-reaching in authority, task, scope, methodology, and the promise. What's more important, obedience to it through the centuries has caused devout followers of Christ to expend an extraordinary amount of time, resources, prayer, and sacrifice to make it come about. Truly, it is great in many respects. It is great in authority. It is a common mistake to think the commission begins with verse 19. I even put it on that slide and showed you a little bit earlier. That seems to be where we want to start, but it doesn't begin there. In verse 18 we read, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." This is an authoritative, This is an authoritative statement about the commission. Authority is different from power. One can wield a lot of power, but yet not have the proper authority to do so. During his final meeting with them, recorded in Acts 1, Jesus would remind the disciples of the power that they have available to them. But for now, he needs them to understand that his absolute, all-inclusive authority was the basis for engaging in world evangelization. What right would they have to proclaim the gospel? It would be the right given to them by Jesus' authority. They have the right to go on mission anywhere, enter any country, encounter any culture, or witness in any community, to persuade any person to believe that Jesus was who he said he was. Therefore, this right is indisputable. It was the authority that gave Peter the boldness, when questioned about his witness, to say to the Jewish religious leaders in Acts 5, "We must obey God rather than men." That is audacious. But Peter's audacity was based on divine authority that we can read about right here. When Jesus mentioned his authority, it probably prompted the disciples to recall the words of the prophet Daniel when in a vision he saw a preview of God's authority. This is a prophecy now, he was given authority. Jesus was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. That's Daniel 7, verse 14. That the mandate had its origin in God, whose sovereign rule is over all creation, is significant to the Great Commission. It is significant because it precludes that no man anywhere, no matter what their position of authority is, can ever rightfully claim that the mission of the church is invalid or unjustified. And many have tried. No church anywhere can claim exemption from obeying this commission. The mission given to the church is irrevocable, it's unstoppable, and the propagation of the good news of Jesus Christ is God's sanctioned plan for this era in human history, and Jesus stands behind it. The realization that God's authority transcends all others and underpins the Great Commission has important practical implications. One, for the missionary. The missionary has the ongoing confidence that he or she is doing what is authorized by God. I can tell you, working in missions today, there's plenty of people that say we have no right to share the gospel. In fact, this last week there was a movie released by Disney and National Geographic. It's called The Mission. It's about the life of John Allen Chau, actually about his death as a martyr in the Sentinelese Islands. And in that movie, they make the case that missionaries have no right to do what they want. But these verses say we do. Jesus said we do. This authority also extends for sending churches. Sending churches like this one can know with certainty that your mission to the world is totally worthwhile and worthy of whatever efforts and resources, personnel, prayer projects, money, whatever it might be, that you want to bring to bear on the commission. And also for the receiving church or the people that are receiving the missionaries. They can recognize that foreign assistance from fellow believers can be welcomed and utilized as it advances toward maturity, toward autonomy, and toward the capability of those fellowships and churches themselves to reach out and send missionaries. Outside assistance is to be accepted not on the basis of availability, nor because it is charitable, but because of the provision that has been provided and authorized by God Himself. Also for governments, no matter what the country or who the leader is, those placed in governmental authority need to recognize that the Christian mission is not a form of foreign imperialism, nor is it meddling in their internal affairs, nor are God's ambassadors who are in their country a disguise for foreign spiritual ploys menacingly disrupting local communities. Rather, missions is something that has been mandated from a higher authority than they themselves possess. Now, I know they don't all agree with that, but let me tell you, there are missionaries. As far as I know, there's missionaries in every nation on the earth right now. There isn't one that doesn't have missionaries. So fortunately, brave missionaries have taken the gospel forward into some very hostile and difficult places. Herbert Kane once wrote, "The Great Commission is based on the supremacy and sovereignty of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who in the incarnation became the Son of Man, that through his death and resurrection he might become the Savior and sovereign of the world. He is not only the head of the church and the Lord of the harvest, he is also the Lord of history, the King of the nations, and the arbiter of human destiny. Sooner or later, all men will come to terms with him. He and he alone has the right to demand universal allegiance." So there's a lot of authority in this commission. It's also great in task. Jesus next tells his disciples what the specific task of the mission is to be. "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you." If there's a focal point in the Great Commission, this is it. In the previous chapter, in the previous verse that we covered, it was noted that evangelism is the highest priority of Jesus' mission. Now Jesus tells them that if the evangelism, this is not written right here. Now Jesus tells them that after the evangelism happens, the next step in the process is going to be making disciples. It's discipleship. What that means and how it is to be done is clarified by Jesus. An examination of the grammar shows that this sentence has actually 4 verbs. It consists of an imperative tied to 3 accompanying participles. The principal verb of the sentence is not the first one, which is go, but rather the second one, which is make disciples. The centerpiece of Jesus' command is the making of disciples. The intent of the sentence becomes clear when diagrammed as follows. I think I have a slide. Yes. So the primary thing that we're looking at here is to make disciples of all nations. It's bolded. But along with that is, as you are going, baptizing them and teaching them, and under baptizing them, it tells us it's to be done in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them is to obey everything I have commanded you. Robert Coleman has stated the ultimate goal of Jesus for his disciples was that his life be reproduced through them in the lives of others. The making of disciples is not just making converts. Evangelism is not complete when a person gives a simple assent to the gospel message. The raising of a hand, the walking of an aisle, the uttering of a sinner's prayer is not what we're after here. That is the beginning, perhaps, but the destination is discipleship. Evangelism initiates the process of a person becoming a consistent follower of the Savior in whom they now believe. So what does it mean to be a disciple? It means to be a complete and competent follower of Jesus Christ. It's the process where matured believers build personal relationships with new believers for the purpose of producing growing and competent followers of Jesus Christ. The process develops over a period of time and demands the building of relationship with God and with others. So the goal here is the authentic, lifelong followership of Jesus. That's what we're after. I like the way George Peters described it. Discipleship is a path rather than an achievement. None of us ever really arrive. It's a lifelong journey. It's a perpetual school. Now, the disciples understood firsthand what this discipleship process entailed, right? They just lived it for 3 years with Jesus. They had seen how he reacted to other people. They had seen how he fellowshiped with them. He'd watched him heal. He'd seen him proclaim. He saw him turn the tables over in the temple. All of those things were object lessons, life-on-life lessons. Jesus goes on to tell the disciples that making others into disciples is a 3-step process. First, by going to those who had no exposure. That's the going. Second, by calling them into a relationship with Jesus. And third, by teaching them to observe all that he commanded. I'm going to actually skip over a little bit of this for time's sake. And I want to tell you, let's back up one here. Let me give you an example of how you see that happen in somebody else's life. When we were working in Bosnia, so we had a war that created all these refugees. I talked about Milenko to you already. You heard that story. Well, there was also a war in Kosovo. It happened about 2 years after we'd moved there. And when the war in Kosovo happened, it created a new refugee stream with the Kosovar Muslims heading north into Bosnia. Now, Bosnia was already a place, we had 88% unemployment in the country. Think about what that'd be like, okay? I mean, even people that weren't refugees were living by humanitarian aid, okay? The whole country was broken. And now in comes a new influx of Kosovar people that were refugees. And I had this guy that, he was a believer, a new believer named Stavo. And Stavo kind of worked with our team to help us with, we actually hired him. He did lots of bureaucracy for us. It's a former communist country, so there's lots of bureaucracy to deal with. And he worked with us on that. And one day, Stavo and I were moving along. We had a little minivan. We were driving, and I said to Stavo, we passed a bunch of these Kosovar refugees walking along the side of the road. I said, Stavo, our church needs to reach out to those guys. And Stavo, he actually cursed under his breath in Serbo-Croatian. I'm like, Stavo, what did you just say? And he says, Ted, you don't get it. Those people are worse than pigs. And the discrimination that they had against the Kosovars was so thick, you can't even imagine it. And we tried for the next couple of weeks to kind of coerce and talk our new group of believers into helping us do outreach to the Kosovar Albanians. And one of them at one point literally said they're not worthy of Jesus. So we decided as the foreign missionaries that we were not going to stand by and let them stop us. We were going to minister to them anyway. And one guy on our team in particular, his name was Joe. Joe was, I don't know, he's about 6'5". He was a bodybuilder, literally a bodybuilder. He was Mr. All-Natural Florida one year. Great big, huge dude, kind of a scary-looking guy, but really good with sports ministry. So he got some balls together, and he actually made a weight room right next to this refugee camp and invited all the young men to come and work out and play with him in sports. And he very boldly began to talk about Jesus to all these refugees. It was funny because we had to be a little bit careful in Bosnian culture of being too aggressive in evangelism, but they didn't care at all what we did with the Kosovars, right? Have your way. So these two young men got saved. Eddie and Barrow, that's kind of what we called them. They actually had some Kosovar names, but their last name was Hoxha. And in that culture, that means imam or Muslim leader. And their dad was the head of the mosque back home in Kosovo. And these two guys, when I say they got saved, I've never seen two young men get so saved as these guys got saved. It's like they just wanted to read the Bible all the time and talk about what it means to be a Christian. And they were inviting everybody to Bible studies. They were just like so on fire for the Lord. And after they were in Bible study with Joe for 7 or 8 weeks, they found out that we had a church, a Bosnians meeting in downtown Sarajevo. They didn't know that we had a church meeting. And they're like, well, we want to come to church. And I thought to myself, wow, that's going to cause some problems with the Bosnians if we invite them to church. But you're not going to tell somebody you can't come to church, right? So, of course, come on, Eddie and Barrow, come on. So we were having a church service. It was actually a Sunday morning. We were using that traditional time frame. And the church was about half full. It wasn't a big room. It was probably there's probably as many seats as right here in this section right here. But there was a little aisle down the middle for people to get in and out, maybe 3 chairs on each side. And everybody's in there. And then Eddie and Barrow come walking in the back. And the room literally falls silent as everybody turns around and sees these two Kosovars walk in. Well, then the conversation starts picking up. And they'd never been to church before, so they didn't know any better. So they came up and they sat right in the front 2 seats, you know. And in our church service, there's a time when we used to, after we do the worship, we'd have some worship time and maybe some announcements, and then we'd have a prayer time. And we would pause and we would take prayer requests from the whole congregation. And so in the middle of the service, I basically say, okay, does anybody have anything that they want to ask for prayer about or they want to share with the congregation? And like immediately, Eddie's hand shoots up. I'm thinking, oh no, what's he going to say? He stands up. I say, okay, Eddie. He stands up and he turns around, looks at the whole room, and he says, man, I am so in love with Jesus. I'm so glad to be here with you. And I have a whole room full of new brothers and sisters. He's got a big, huge smile on his face. And right then, my eye catches Stavo. And he's looking right at me, and there's a little tear coming down his cheek. And he kind of shakes his head. And after the church service, he comes up to me and he says, man, I am so wrong in my attitude toward these people, aren't I? And he was broken, like really broken. That is discipleship at work right there, okay? God using a situation to reveal the heart in a way that otherwise is not going to get revealed. And I didn't do anything particularly smart or crafty as a missionary. God made that happen in that context. And you got to remember, Bosnia was a place where neighbors were literally killing each other, literally doing that. And issues of race, they don't call it racism because they're all the same race, but it's ethnic hatred. Those are things we talked about, and those are things we tried to kind of work on all the time. But this object lesson that happened in real life was so much more powerful than anything we could have done kind of didactically to teach them or to lead them in any certain way. So, that is the kind of thing that's wrapped up in this verse where it says to make disciples of all nations. And by the way, I would just say that from my perspective, the three most significant components, or let me say it this way, the three most significant activities that reveal that somebody's doing the Great Commission is if they're doing evangelism, discipleship, or church planting. Now let me explain those three. So evangelism and discipleship, they're commands. Jesus commands us to do that. But church planting is an outcome. If you do evangelism and you do discipleship, churches will emerge. So you've heard I lead this thing called Missio Nexus. And it is an association of about 325 mission agencies and a couple hundred churches. And we don't have like lengthy policy statements and documents about who can be a member and who can't be a member. What we try to do instead is we ask the question, do you do evangelism, discipleship, or church planting? If you do any of those three, then you're going to be a fit for us, because those are the three things that we focus on as we go about doing the Great Commission. Okay, let me go on, and we're going to finish up here soon. Next, it's great in scope. What specifically did Jesus mean when he said all nations? The immediate response would indicate that Jesus seemed to be speaking of nations as we understand them. Currently, there's about 238 nations on the planet. Is this what Jesus means? If so, it could be argued that a good share of people have been reached in every nation, and therefore the Great Commission has been accomplished. But, of course, that is not what Jesus meant. The concept of the modern nation state didn't really exist in Jesus' day. The phrase panta ta ethne, which is the Greek here, is a more technical phrase. Panta means all, ta is the, ethne is nations. But there is a more precise meaning. Again, we'll read from a Lausanne document that Ralph Winter proposed. He said that the task of making disciples of the nations is much more involved and much greater in scope than simply reaching geopolitical nations. We should understand this phrase to be intended as ethno-linguistic peoples or groups. It is better to see the human race divided into their ethno-linguistic groupings rather than the artificial divides that humans have derived politically. So subsequently, the people group idea among missionaries was refined and defined this way. A people group is a significantly large grouping of individuals who perceive themselves to have a common affinity for one another because of their shared language, religion, ethnicity, residence, occupation, class or caste, situation, etc., or a combination of these. The largest group within which the gospel can spread as a church planting movement without encouraging barriers of understanding or acceptance. Do you remember when I said evangelism is a friends and family plan? It's because the gospel naturally follows along those routes. This concept of people groups, those are the bumps over which the gospel must be carried by somebody for meaning to enter in across that barrier. Jesus intends for people to be converted and made disciples of from every people group, the panta ta ethne, rather than just from entire political nations. In fact, you could do a survey of the biblical use of this term. Even in the Hebrew, the same concept arises. Abraham was to be a blessing to the nations. We find that in Genesis 12. Interestingly, the Greek Septuagint, okay, so the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, right? How did they translate the Hebrew nations? Panta ta ethne, the same thing that we see in Matthew 28. Of course, this blessing of Abraham would only happened through distant descendants. This phrase is used in various other places in the New Testament. Because of time, we can't go into all of these. Luke 24:47. Even in Revelation, you read it, 5:9, 7:9, etc. There's a heavenly vision found in Revelation 15:3 and 4. Again, it's this concept of ethno-linguistic people groups. Okay, let's talk about this for 1 second. We got to be a little careful with the phrase because in our day and age, it's become an anthropological idea, okay? As groups, take Wycliffe Bible translators, try to figure out what a group looks like. They've had to create some anthropological understandings and ideas about what a people group might be. Oftentimes, these distinctions are not clear. Today, the Joshua Project says there are 17,435 distinct ethno-linguistic people groups. Of these, 7,398 are considered unreached. So we have a long way to go in reaching all of them. The scope of this mission is vast. He is telling his church that its evangelistic task should not be considered completed until there is a representative from every ethno-linguistic people group praising Jesus. It's also great in promise. Jesus closes his instruction with the most tender of assurances, meant to encourage the heart of those who would engage in the Great Commission. He leaves the disciples with the promise that he will always be with them as they spread the good news far and wide. You could call this the comforting clause of the Great Commission. Jesus finishes it by saying, "And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." You see, Jesus knew that in a few short weeks, he would leave his disciples permanently. But because of his abiding spiritual presence with them after his ascension, he promises to go with each of the 11 as they in turn go on their various mission outreaches. Although the impact of this promise was probably not realized when given, what a comfort it must have been to the disciples as they later fanned out literally across the globe. Although the end of the age has sometimes been translated as end of the world, the temporal rendering is more accurate than the geographical one. It is the same word from which we get our word eons. I'm going to be with you to the end of the eons of time. This may be a technical point, but it's reassuring to know that even more than at any place, Jesus is with his messengers in every age and at all times. There is no place that you can go in service of the Great Commission that Jesus won't be there with you. So that is why the Great Commission is so great. It is great in authority, it is great in task, it is great in scope, it is great in promises. In its promise. In this key verse of the 5 verses we are looking at, we find that Matthew 28, 18-20 is about the method. It's about the way that Jesus expects us to take the gospel message out to the nations. A few years ago, I was visiting some missionaries in a place where there are many unreached people groups. The people in this area of the world, mostly bordering Chad and Sudan, missiologists have actually given it a name. They call it the Chad cluster because there's so many unreached people groups right in this area. While we were there, I had the great privilege of meeting a missionary from southern Chad, where there are many churches. Okay, so we're in the north. He's from the south. His skin was black. He looked very African. The people he was ministering to are Arab. They have lighter features. They're very discriminatory against dark-skinned Africans. He was telling me about the persecution he was receiving at the hands of these people, not just because he was a Christian, but because he was a black person. One of the little team that we were with couldn't help but ask, "Why do you do it?" With a big smile on his face, he said, "Not long ago, missionaries came to my village and shared the gospel with us. he went on to say that there was incredible transformation, not only in their village, but he specifically talked about the changes in his own father as he grew as a disciple of Jesus. I won't go into it, but he was horrifically treated by his father, who mourned what he had done to his son when he became a Christian. Then he got serious and he said, I want that same blessing that I received in my village and our village received together to be shared by these people. Unless you're Jewish, that same story is true for all of our cultures. You know, I'm Danish. My ancestors were the Vikings. I am so glad the gospel came to the Vikings. My people lived a hard, hard life. Do you know that they took women, when they went marauding, they would capture women and take them back to Scandinavia. You know why they took them back? Because it was common for Viking moms to strangle little girls upon birth because they wanted warrior men. They practiced infanticide. Vikings loved the taste of blood. They literally loved it. They would lick the blood off their enemies, and they would lick the wounds of their fellow soldiers to get the taste in their mouth. They were evil in their killing. You know, the Romans, when they died, they often freed their slaves. You know what the Vikings did to their slaves? When they died, they killed them all. They were brutal. I could go on. I could tell you more. I'm not even giving you a little bit of the heinous things that my people did. But sometime about maybe 600-700 years ago, a missionary reached out to the Danes. Some were persecuted. We have accounts of the missionaries that were killed by the Vikings as they tried to take the gospel to them. But praise God that missionaries knew that Jesus was with them. They kept on, and they pressed forward. And now today, I know Jesus, and my family has for generations been able to pass the gospel down as each of us have come to know Christ ourselves. Every culture has redemptive and wonderful things. The Vikings actually had some redemptive and wonderful things too. Art. When women were allowed to live, many of them rose to ranks of leadership. They were democratic. One of the few tribes that we know of in ancient times that let everybody in the community have a say in decisions. So there's good things there too, and we find those redemptive, good things. We should definitely encourage them. But just like my friend in Chad was so glad that the gospel came to him through missionaries, I too am glad. Because it makes a difference in the lives of people. We've looked at John 20:21, the model of mission. Mark 16:15, the magnitude of mission. And now Matthew 28:18-20, the method of mission. Okay, so that's where we've crossed through so far.